Yeah, I'm Markus Jäntti. I'm a professor of public economics at the University of Helsinki and at the Economic Research Institute, also in Helsinki, and I was formerly a professor of economics at Stockholm University and research director for the Luxembourg income study.
Okay, well, may I ask you how you perceive the relationship between the economic crisis and human rights protection?
I guess I think that the main goal of economic policy is to further the economic and social well-being of people, citizens. And of course that's the point of human rights protection also. And so I think one should in particular in an economic downturn be concerned with the well-being of the most vulnerable groups. To some extent, in many countries this has been achieved for some groups. So for instance, in most countries, pensioners were reasonably well protected. This, of course, was not the case in all countries, most notably, of course, in Greece, but in many cases they were, but other groups are not. So for instance, children in particular kinds of households may be vulnerable to economic policy measures directed at increasing labor force participation, for instance. And there, I think insufficient weight has been given to the protection of children, counterbalancing the kind of the need to try to get unemployed persons and persons who are outside of the labor force employed again. So the proper balancing of the interests of different parties, I think, has been neglected. And I kind of, there's a tendency among decision makers and among the media, among the public, and even among social scientists to not quite realize that there is no such thing as the interests of the economy. There are only interests of persons. And economic policy really, in essence, is about the interests of persons. It then so happens that macroeconomic policy discussions often take place in quite abstract terms where we perceive of there being agents who are not persons, but that's a simplification for the purposes of discussion. It's not about the essence of economic policy. And then, again, in this regard, I think human rights interests of economic and social policy, or in a sense the subjects of economic and social policy, they're shared with those who are about human rights.
Thank you very much. So if I may perhaps ask you about more the economic consequences of austerity measures, what's your impression on those economic consequences?
Well, we don't quite know yet. It's unfortunately in the nature of the analysis of the consequences of economic policy that we'll know with a greater certainty many years later what has happened, in part because it simply takes a long time to gather the necessary data and so on. We do have reason to believe, however, based in part on European-wide so-called micro-simulation results done at the University of Essex, that there's a lot of variation in how austerity policies have affected different kinds of persons and households. In some countries the impact is large, especially at the low end. In some cases the impacts are less big, they're more directed to the middle and upper classes. So how austerity, what is also called fiscal consolidation, sounds very neutral, has affected households varies from country to country and by quite a lot. What we don't know, we do know about these kind of large fiscal consolidation efforts. We don't know about what you might call a kind of silent these kind of more silent austerity measures, which aren't as large and dramatic, how they have affected persons. I've seen no effort to jointly analyze the impact of those. But again, from Euromod analyses, we do know that there's substantial variation across countries in how these play out. Exactly why that substantial variation exists is hard to give a coherent account of. It depends on country circumstances, and to some extent, of course, about power constellations within the countries. But I think with some time we'll probably understand them better.
Thank you. And a final question, perhaps if you have some recommendations on how you think we could tackle financial inequality in those times of austerity measures.
Well, again, I think it's the really important part is to identify and recognize cases where there are counteracting interests. Again, taking the case of child families, especially lone parent families, which on the one hand we would like them to be in employment, and on the other hand the kinds of policies we pursue in order to increase the employment of such households may lead to there being the household members suffering from economic hardship. Essentially, one of the ways in which we try to get people into the labor force is by reducing the benefits available to them when they're not. If this causes them to enter the labor force, then their incomes increase, and also those in their households enjoy a higher standard of living. If they don't become employed, then they just suffer from the low income. And I think the important part is to recognize not only the potential benefits from pursuing certain kinds of policies, but identifying the risks. So to take another example from the upper end of the income distribution, decision makers are very apt to emphasize the risks associated with taxing capital incomes or taxing companies, whereas the benefits in terms of consolidating fiscal balances are rarely discussed in as explicit terms. So somehow it seems to me that what we need to do is have more frank discussions about the benefits and costs of various kinds of actions, and go from there. And I think we can learn a lot from studying what actually happened in those countries affected by large austerity programs during the crisis, to see that, because to some extent exactly what actions are chosen is idiosyncratic and due to, in part, the kinds of institutions that are in place in each country, but in part to almost accidental circumstances, and then to take a closer look at who were affected, how well the economy recovered, and so on, can teach us a lot that we can hopefully draw on the next time these things happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jäntti. Thanks.
Thank you.